Hello, History 72A Winter Quarter 2024. You all have survived your first week of class now. Some of you have done both quizzes, some of you have done one, and you've started thinking about Stage A. Some people have actually even turned in Stage A. Generally, I don't recommend turning it in more than maybe a few days early, just so that you have time to go to section and find out what your particular TA wants from you for that stage, maybe in more detail than I've put on the directions, because it will be your TA who will be the one who grades it. This is the last lecture in Module A, and it is a basic foundations lecture. If you don't know the story of the Millennium Tower in San Francisco, that's not an optical illusion. It actually leans. I think they may have fixed it by now, but after it was built, it started to lean sideways. It's an illustration of what happens if you build without a suitable foundation. In this lecture, we'll lay down the basics of an approach to studying history that will be incredibly important to us for the entire quarter and beyond, really. We will consider the history of words, particularly relevant to this class, and we will apply those ideas to parsing a primary source to get us started into American history. In the title, I left the social out of social construction because I wanted the alliteration. Construction, Columbus, critically, creatively. I have to find my amusement where I can. It matters, however, that it is social construction theory. I started easing you into social construction theory in the last lecture. You might remember that I said it is the social that is being constructed, not doing the construction. My experience teaching social construction theory, and honestly, in first learning it myself, is that people make heavy weather of it to begin with. It seems terribly complex, and then suddenly it all falls into place, and we wonder why we ever thought it was that complicated. I am telling you this now because I am going to explain social construction theory multiple times using different approaches. So if anything does not seem to make sense, do not stop the video right away and give up. If you are already familiar with social construction theory, or it makes sense to you after one trip through the video, that's great. But if you go through this video once and maybe parts of it more than once and feel like you still don't quite get it, there is nothing wrong with you. You will just hit that aha moment at another point, and that's totally okay. You can even have your aha moment anytime during or after the course and still be fine in the class. But basically, social construction theory will show up in everything that we're talking about, even if I don't point it out or bring it up. In the third part of this lecture, when we look at how to examine a primary source using Columbus's account of his first journey to the Western Hemisphere as an example, you will see social construction theory in practice, even if I do not specifically draw your attention to it. So as a reminder, social construction theory is not about the way that society structures individuals. That's nurture. Social construction is about the way that an overarching society is built or constructed. In other words, the social in social construction is what is being constructed, not what is doing the construction. I have found that people tend to find social construction theory difficult, partly because they confuse it with nurture. Nurture describes the degree to which characteristics of an individual are shaped by the society they grow up in. This is usually opposed to nature, or the degree to which characteristics of an individual are shaped by biology or heredity. These both, nature and nurture, start from the assumption that society is a set thing. Whatever categories exist in society are universal, and it's just a matter of figuring out why each individual shows a certain characteristic and should be put into one bin or another of a supposedly unchanging category. Social construction theory is concerned with how societies are constructed and how this relates to the distribution of power in a society. The starting question is not which bin does this individual fit for this characteristic, but rather, why does this society consider this particular type of variability meaningful? And why have they divided up and labeled the sorting bins the way that they have? Scholars in other branches of the social sciences and humanities generally consider the present with respect to time. Their social construction questions have to do first with distribution of power now and how this impacts the lives of people in the present. Historians, of course, consider the past. So our approach is to look over time and see the points at which a particular society became invested in categorizing people by a particular variable trait, and when and why they started dividing people up the way that they have. This is a big part of why I have been stressing historical context so much. As humans who live in our own historical context, it is exceedingly difficult for historians not to assume that societies in the past have been structured based on the same characteristics as our own. It is difficult to avoid starting from the idea that those societies divided up characteristics the same way we do, sorted everyone into the same sorting bins that we do, and gave the sorting bins hierarchical values. Maybe the same as ours now, maybe different, but compared to one another in some way with an attribution of differential worth. In other words, the folks in one sorting bin somehow matter more than folks in the other one. But if we assume that all societies are constructed the same way, we look for what we expect to see and often miss alternative ways of sorting or not sorting society. This is especially difficult if we are studying our own history. For example, me studying American history, because the past forms of society that we are looking at have given rise to our own forms of society. We are going to see similarities going back in time, but not because we are seeing universal or inevitable ideas or values. Incidentally, the word I keep saying after sorting is bins, B-I-N-S, like little buckets, basically containers used to hold anything. And this example here, I have for you to think about the different ways that you could sort these. Pens versus pencils, you could sort them by the color of the exterior. You could sort them by whether they have erasers or don't have erasers. You could sort them by whether they have to be sharpened or whether that you eject the ink part by pressing here or pressing somewhere else. Those are all different ways that you could look at the stack of objects and sort them differently. Both essentialism and social constructionism are theoretical models. They come in various levels. That's discussed in the Vance article, V-A-N-C-E, Vance article. And there can be a certain amount of overlap between them. It's not like there's some sort of fight to the death between these models. It's a matter of using each one appropriately so that we actually understand more. Essentialism takes the importance of a particular category as universal. The assumption is that a given way of dividing people up by any variable trait is meaningful across time and space. Essentialism includes both nature and nurture approaches to understanding traits in an individual. Social constructionism posits that the very categories that essentialists take for granted are often only meaningful in a particular historical context. This approach asks questions about how power is allocated in a society and why. American society in the 20th century considered sexuality an important category of human variation that supposedly naturally had an impact on a person's position and role in society. In the context in which we use sexuality now, we often mean sexual object choice, or who we would like most to boink, never mind that this may change over time. American society currently divides people by the relationship between the sex they are assigned by society relative to the sex of the person they are attracted to. But this is by no means the only way in which humans might be divided, not even moving beyond a category that we might recognize as sexuality now. The rules for sexual intercourse in ancient Greece had to do with who was a citizen and who was not. A citizen was a native-born adult male permitted to engage in political debate. It was not a problem if a citizen had sex with a non-citizen, so young men, women, and so on. But if two citizens had sex with one another, that was problematic, not because both individuals were male, but because they were both citizens. To return to current ideas about sexuality, in the late 19th century, many Western countries, including, or really especially the US, started dividing people into a rigid binary, homosexual, heterosexual. But people do not divide neatly that way. Some people have a settled single type of attraction related to the assigned sex of their object choice, and some do not. So now we have bisexual, pansexual, and more, but that's just adding more sorting bins, not really assessing why we need this particular set of bins to begin with. We see something similar in ancient Greece. What seemed like a really clear system was really not. Slaves were not citizens, but was it really okay for a high status citizen to have sex with an unmanumitted or unfreed slave, or even with one given their freedom for that matter? It is vanishingly rare for humans to fit perfectly into two categories of anything. In fact, I cannot, off the top of my head, think of any perfectly binary quality. Let me know if you come up with one. So far, I haven't gotten one from students in this class, but I'm always waiting and always receptive. Moreover, why should whom someone has sex with at some point in their life be a major factor in structuring our society at all? What I am able to do well or poorly has indeed changed over time, but in no case has that change been even remotely related to either the people I have been physically attracted to or to the identity of those with whom I have had sexual relations. Nevertheless, an essentialist approach would assume that the sorting bins labeled homosexual and heterosexual could be used to reliably divide up all humans in all places at all times. Note that if we add more bins, for example, bisexual or asexual, nothing about this example changes except the number of bins. An essentialist approach would assume that an analog to the bin homosexual would exist in every other culture around the globe in all time periods, even if the exact word on the label varied by language. The essentialist would assume that the definition that their own society uses to identify someone as belonging to the homosexual bin would be the exact same again in every place, in every time period. The essentialist approach accepts that there are or were other words in different languages, but assumes that one of those words could simply be substituted in for the word homosexual, and it would have precisely the same meaning and be understood in society in precisely the same way. A social constructionist approach acknowledges that there is variability in sexual object choice between individuals, but would say that not every society is necessarily going to consider sexual object choice a critical or even useful way of sorting people into bins. The bins dividing and labeling having a sexuality characteristic here, homosexual and heterosexual, are only one of an infinity of ways to sort human variability. A social constructionist approach would caution that you must understand the entirety of a society to understand A, whether sexual object choice is a major factor in organizing society, B, if it is, how it is divided into bins and sorted, and C, how this is woven into systems of power. Note that sexuality is not the only category that can be socially constructed. Race, gender, sex, and age can also be examined as social constructions. The social constructionist is most emphatically not saying that there is no variability in humans. Clearly, we can recognize our friends and family because we are not all identical. Likewise, clearly our bodies age in the sense that they change in more or less predictable ways over the course of our lives. The issue is whether any aspect of that variability becomes central to defining power structures in a society. For example, is it used to determine who can do certain work or live in certain places? The social constructionist is also not saying that the categories, once defined by a society, are somehow not real or not important. We know from experience that they are both, only that their reality and importance are specific to the time and place in which they have been identified as a crucial way of sorting human variation, given defined bins and made part of the social structure. We can see the way that these bins have shifted in their precise content and description by looking at changes in language over time. The OED is the Oxford English Dictionary. To me, it looks sort of like those books you expect to see in an alchemist's library. It was started around 150 years ago and is updated on a continuous basis to reflect both changes happening in the English language and more research being done on English language in the past. The OED has its own relation to power differentials. It tends to be slow in entering changes, partly because it covers such a broad time period that transitory uses of words are not worth recording. For example, when I was in high school, everything was asinine to my classmates. Now you hardly hear the word. What makes the OED interesting to us is that it gives more than current definitions. It gives the history of each word, sometimes an incredibly lengthy history. You can, of course, get the OED online through UCD's Shields Library website. I still think that it is consulted by alchemists in its physical form. If we look at the entry in OED for the English word sexuality, we find that the word has been used to sort people by sexual object choice only since the late 19th century. The words homosexuality, heterosexuality, bisexuality, and pansexuality came into being and gained importance or power successively after that point. We won't cover it in this class, but once the concept of homosexual was constructed in a particular way, scientists in Europe and the US took an essentialist stance and started to look for the root cause of homosexuality. They assumed that what they labeled homosexuality was associated with a discrete, predictable set of traits closely associated with sexual object choice. In the 19th century, those traits were claimed to be things like being emotional, having a slender build, and, quoting this one, it's something about the eyes, meaning people thought or wanted to think that they could recognize just by looking at someone what their sexual preference was. The set of traits and precise meaning of homosexual would change repeatedly over the course of the 20th century. Social constructionists point out that if the supposedly natural and invariant set of traits associated with, and the assumptions made about the category homosexual have changed over and over again from the late 19th through the 20th century, then the variation in sexual object choice, A, is not, in fact, reliably linked to other forms of human variation, like bone structure or brain development, and B, that the variability in human sexual object choice cannot be sorted reliably and consistently into 2 or 3 or 4 separate bins. Researchers using the social constructionist framework would ask why sexual object choice became an issue of prime importance in English-speaking regions in the late 19th century, and how the categories sexuality and the bin homosexual, not the individuals assigned to that bin, but the definition of the bin, functioned in society after that time. One last important point about social construction as a theoretical framework to understand societies past and present, we've noted that sexuality is only one category that is given particular meanings in American society. Remember that categories such as race are also socially constructed. Categories of power are generally constructed together. In this class, we will look at the ways that race, gender, sex, and sexuality have been constructed in interlocking ways in U.S. history. Because these categories are so entrenched in U.S. society, it can be really difficult to step away from them. I often find it useful to think about a broad taste analogy here. This becomes a bit goofy, but stay with me. That sense that the analogy is silly is part of the point. All humans have to eat something to survive. Humans cannot make use of every potential food for survival. Grass doesn't do a whole lot for us, nor dirt, but the range of foods that will keep humans going is actually rather amazingly varied. Humans mostly have structures we identify as tongues, taste buds, nerves, and so on. But from that point, there is broad, indeed nearly infinite individual variation and possibility in the way that we experience food, especially depending on how closely we choose to look and how finely we choose to pin down distinctions. We divide, describe, and understand flavors, sweet, salt, bitter, sour, umami, in ways that seem distinct and straightforward, but we know that taste is much, much more complicated in the actual practice of choosing foods. Some preferences are strongly cultural. Barring absolute starvation, I will never eat insects, no matter how much I know about their physiological qualifications as human food. I would prefer to go my entire life without eating an insect intentionally. I know that I eat them in veg periodically, often without noticing. I know that people eat and enjoy insects, and not as in I double, triple dare you kind of thing, but as food, because physiologically many insects are fine food for humans. I could make up a story about how my ancestors were exposed to a high percentage of poisonous insects, but let's face it, I really do not want to eat insects because of a combination of cultural ideas and personal experiences. My distaste for insects is shared by many people with similar cultural upbringings, but not all. Some people raised in 20th century America are totally fine with insects as food. So the things that you are looking at here are candy corn, natto. My mother-in-law was raised eating natto, and I have tried many times to eat it, and I can't like it no matter how hard I try. Oysters, pork, insects, Brussels sprouts, and broccoli. Welcome to social construction example number 2, the high-stakes world of Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts seem to be quite popular now. Fried Brussels sprouts appear on trendy food menus. However, in the second half of the 20th century, so 1960s, 70s, so on, most white American children turned up their noses at Brussels sprouts. Now, not British children, because Brussels sprouts are something that you eat at winter holiday time. American children were almost certainly, in part, turning up their noses at Brussels sprouts because they were usually boiled to within an inch of their existence. But researchers did some digging for innate or essential reasons that white American children were not enthusiastic about the cute little miniature cabbage looking things. They found that Brussels sprouts, like many other members of the Brassica genus, cabbage, broccoli, kale, turnips, and so on, contain phenylthiourea, or PTC for short. Some people are highly sensitive to PTC and dislike it intensely. Some people cannot taste it at all and are totally unaffected by its presence. In the mid 20th century, scientists hypothesized that people who could taste PTC would hate Brussels sprouts because usually if you see someone, you put PTC on their tongue, they will make a horrible face if they taste it straight like that. And scientists also hypothesized that non-tasters would be fine with Brussels sprouts. Through the late 20th century, scientists mapped out PTC tasting as a binary on-off Mendelian trait. More recent work has linked PTC to a family of genes and identified the products of one gene in particular that codes for a product associated with PTC tasting. From the mid 20th century, PTC tasting, not tasting, was used by population geneticists and anthropologists to study human prehistory and migrations. An essentialist approach to Brussels sprout liking is to look for either a cultural or genetic basis. Either way, the essentialist approach is starting from the assumption that liking or not liking Brussels sprouts matters in some way, and that researchers need to explain the variability in Brussels sprout preference. The model used with the essentialist approach is if A, and that can be culture or genes or a combination, then B, tasting or not tasting PTC, then C, liking or not liking Brussels sprouts. If A is cultural causes, for example, if a society relies on Brussels sprouts, then people learn to like Brussels sprouts from a young age, and then culture is responsible for liking or not liking Brussels sprouts. If A is genetic, for example, if a population has a high proportion of tasters, then they will never start eating Brussels sprouts except when starving, and genes are entirely responsible for liking, not liking Brussels sprouts. And complex and mixed models trying to take into account environmental, cultural, and genetic explanations, because reality tends to be more complicated, like the third model here. And it turns out that PTC tasting is not a simple yes, no, on, off Mendelian character. Plus, some PTC tasters like Brussels sprouts just fine, and there are some non-tasters who do not like Brussels sprouts. These days, models are usually far more complicated than those of the late 20th century and try to account for environmental, cultural, and genetic explanations. Regardless of the complexity or basis of the model, however, the essentialist starts with the idea here that liking Brussels sprouts or not is a type of human variation worth studying in depth in order to understand the root causes of Brussels sprout affinity. What the essentialist approach does not do is ask why we care whether anyone likes or does not like Brussels sprouts to begin with. The starting point assumes that we care. In this case, there's not a whole lot writing on whether or not we like Brussels sprouts. So while the topic may come up in rather restricted scholarly discussions or at dinner tables, it is a matter more of curiosity than anything else. But what if we were to decide to sort society by the foods people ate? and to assign status, permitted activities, and marriage possibilities based on this. We would be constructing our society using Brussels sprouts tasting. In other words, Brussels sprout affinity would be a social construction. And rather than being a matter of curiosity, an individual's Brussels sprouts preference would become critically important. The social constructionist approach would be to wonder how this state of affairs came about and to ask questions like why one group is given more power than another. The social constructionist approach would not say, well, the world has always been sorted by Brussels sprout preference, and that's just how it is. Let's look at two possible societies constructed around eating or not eating Brussels sprouts. In the first, folks who love Brussels sprouts start out in power. And in the second, Brussels sprout haters had the greater ability to influence social structures and values early on. In this society here, Brussels sprout lovers held most of the power early on and chose to make Brussels sprout affinity an important category in structuring society. In this world, only people who loved eating Brussels sprouts could hold high office because clearly, these people could make better use of their environment, and so they were superior. People who had neither an intense liking nor an intense hatred for Brussels sprouts would learn to love them, or at least to eat them in public, so that they could have access to high status sprout lover opportunities. And even some people who hated Brussels sprouts would learn to eat them and hide their repulsion in order to avoid persecution. Conversely, let's say that most people in power at a certain point early on were full tasters and hated Brussels sprouts. Then clearly again, they would be superior because their more sensitive palates proved their sophistication. Non-Brussels sprout eaters would have access to higher status. People who didn't care one way or another about Brussels sprouts would find that they hated them to access the social benefits of being a sprout hater. But then access to high status jobs, education, and living spaces might be limited by genetic testing for PTC tasters. But back to the power structures of our sprout hater society. At least some people at the bottom who liked Brussels sprouts would profess to hate them in order to avoid being discriminated against. And sprout lovers, who nevertheless avoid sprouts for pragmatic reasons, hope that no one develops a way to test them by sneaking a sample of their DNA or putting PTC in their food and seeing if they noticed. Note that a society in which food and taste determined social position and roles would not change the tongue or the fact that people come in an infinite physical and personal variety in their relationship to specific foods. But it would change the options available and the specific choices that people made in negotiating their individual experience of themselves and their world. Some tastes would be malleable or changeable. Some would not be to varying degrees in different individuals, but this would all become extremely relevant rather than merely curious. Brussels sprout affinity would matter in both of these historical contexts. Let's shift back to the world we are more likely to recognize than Sproutopia. We could get some idea of when categories became important in ordering society, in other words, in which historical context they became social constructs, and how the description of both category and individual bins changed over time in the history of English-speaking people by going back to the OED. This gives us suggestions and ideas of patterns and turning points. It does not tell us exactly what happened in different regions or why. That's the job of historians. If we go back to the entry on sexuality, you can see important shifts in the second half of the 18th century and the end of the 19th century. And these times were, in fact, associated with changes in ideas that affected powerful forms of social philosophy in the West. The first is the Enlightenment, and the second is the fusion between science and medicine. I am going to show you heavily edited entries for words and categories that will matter to us in the class. I will put these, if someone reminds me, as a PDF in files, so don't try reading the specifics as you listen, just focus on the points that I'm making. Sexuality here was the shortest entry of the ones that I'm going to show you. Moving on to sex, there are a couple of points in time when the word changed meaning that are of interest to us. Early on in the Middle Ages, the word applied to reproductive functions, not to the classification of whole people. In 1631, which is part of the early modern period covered in this class, the word sex started to include a distinction between people. In other words, sorting bins that encompassed both the body and social role together. So no separation in what we might now call sex and gender. The word gender took a different path, and you can see why I told you that you will not be able to read individual entries on the lecture slides. The word gender has changed meaning or adjusted its sorting bins so often that even with some text edited out here, there is still far more material than we saw under sex. The word gender has also undergone some quite major shifts in meaning. Gender started as a grammatical term, not a word applied to sorting humans. The OED found the earliest written example of using gender to describe people in the Renaissance, 1474. At that point, gender was basically used interchangeably with sex conceptually. It was not until 1945, well after the time period of our class, about 100 years after the ending of our class, in fact, that the words sex and gender were separated and made two distinct bins. Only beginning in 1945 does the OED define gender as the state of being male or female as expressed by social or cultural distinctions and differences rather than biological ones. This division of sex from gender as word concept packages indicating different things has been applied by researchers in several ways, some of them useful and some of them not. Our class covers the period before the physical and social were separated, and you will need to keep that in mind when you read primary sources. It is not that people before 1945 did not understand the difference between sex and gender. It is that the words did not indicate a distinction of the social and physical until the 20th century. People in the past used the words in the way that they were defined in their own historical context. This is the first page, mind you, and heavily edited on the OED entry for woman. I've managed to cut down what is actually in the OED for the word woman to 12 pages, which you can look at if you remind me to post them. The entry is exceptionally long because both the word and the concept associated with it have changed fairly frequently. I use the phrase word concept package. Since you know that both societies and words have histories, either or both members of the word concept pair can, and in this case have, shifted in many historical contexts. Historians need to be really careful not to reflexively apply our own word concept package to woman for earlier times. It is not just that women's roles have changed. The category sex, along with bins labeled man and woman, have changed. The length of the entry gives you some idea of the frequency of change in word concept packages. Woman is a word concept package that has changed a lot over time. Nevertheless, the entry woman is still substantially shorter than the entry for man. Even with a great deal edited out, I only managed to get the entry for man down to 30 pages. We will keep both the idea of social construction of categories that influence power in society and the idea that word concept packages used to reflect categories of power are far more malleable than they may appear as we think about how to read primary documents for information beyond the most superficial. When you approach a primary source, you want to start asking basic questions right away. Your first questions are, who wrote it and when did they write it? Then what type of document is it? What language did they write it in? Is that the same language that you will be reading it in? You can answer these questions for the Columbus piece by looking at both the introduction above the document on the text that I've given you, the PDF, and an original first page of the document in your reading. This is one of those original first pages. When you have finished the first stage, you know about your document, but you do not know, nor have you analyzed what is in your document. The answers here to who wrote it, Christopher Columbus. And you know that because it's stated on the document and because I'm telling you so. But you could also tell it from the document itself. When did they write it? And that's in the intro part to the article. Columbus wrote it after he took his first transatlantic trip in 1492. What type of document is it? Well, this is interesting. Ostensibly, this document is a letter to Ferdinand and Isabella, the rulers of Spain who funded Columbus's expedition. But there were many copies of it printed and posted in different European nations. So obviously it wasn't only written for Ferdinand and Isabella. What language was it originally written in? Latin. Is it the same language you will be reading it in? Probably not. Probably you will read it in translation. The second stage for tackling your primary source is to read the document. If it is short, like the Columbus one, read the entire thing. Read it over, don't get stuck, read it. If it is long, you might want to look through it so that you have read enough to have a clear idea of what the text is actually saying. Now that you know the basic context of your primary source and you've read your source so that you know what it literally says, you should know the who, what, when, where, how, and maybe the why surrounding the existence of your document. And you have some idea of what your document was discussing. Now, go find out more about the historical context of your source. Make certain that you are not reading your document only with 21st century eyes. Part of finding out about the context is base level pragmatic. If you don't know who Columbus was, if you don't know who Ferdinand and Isabella were, if you don't know what was happening at the end of the 15th century, you'll have a hard time really understanding the document that you're reading. And then part of it is the more you know about the context, the more you will understand about the way that the people you're reading, the way the people who wrote and read the document looked at the world. Now, ask another set of questions. Why did this person write this source? There is rarely a single isolated reason for any action. So ask yourself, after you've answered the first why else did they write the source? Think about potential layers of motivation for anything and recognize that some of those motivations may be in conflict with one another. You will realize at this point that you are developing other questions in order to answer the questions that you've just been asking. So go back and read your source again. You've developed your background research more now, and you will notice and understand things that did not strike you on the first go around when you read the document. So seriously, go back and read it again. And you will develop, this is a cycle, your own questions from this point on. And you'll go back and forth between your questions, the study of the context, and the study of your document until you've satisfied yourself that you can answer the questions that you originally had, the why question, the what did this mean at the time question, or until your due date comes up, because most of us will keep working on things until we're forced to turn them in. Key points for Lecture 4. Nature nurture studies are concerned with the individual in a society. Nurture examines the degree to which characteristics of an individual are shaped by the society they grow up in. Nature examines the degree to which characteristics of an individual are shaped by biology heredity. Social construction theory is concerned with how societies are constructed and how this relates to the distribution of power in a society. The starting question is not which bin does this individual fit into for this characteristic, but why does this society consider this type of variability meaningful? And why have they divided up and labeled the bins the way that they have? Essentialism takes the importance of a particular category as universal. The assumption is that a given way of dividing people up by any variable trait is meaningful across time and space. And this includes both the nurture and the nature approaches to understanding traits in an individual. Social constructionism posits that the very categories that essentialists take for granted are only meaningful in a particular historical context. This approach asks questions about how power is allocated in a society and why. Both social constructionism and essentialism are theoretical models or approaches that ask different types of questions. They are not mutually exclusive at all levels. Only the most hardcore essentialists and social constructionists are locked in a bitter battle. We can ignore those. Words have histories. Concepts have histories. Word concept packages may change in the word part, the concept part, or both in any given historical context. Tackle primary sources in stages. Stage 1, ask basic questions about your source. Who wrote it? When did they write it? What type of document is it? What language did they write it in? Is it the same language you will be reading it in? Stage 2, read the text of your primary source. Stage 3, go find out more about the historical context of your source. Stage 4, ask another set of questions. Why did the person or people write or produce this source? And then, why else did they write or produce this source? There is rarely only one layer of motivation for anything, and some motivations may conflict with one another. And then you'll realize that you are developing more questions in order to answer the questions you have, or you think of more questions, and it becomes a cycle until you are forced to turn the thing in. But before you do that, you should go back and read the text of your primary source again, because you will read it differently now than you did the first time. And then you'll develop more questions, and then you'll go back and read it again. And then finally someone will say, it's good enough, turn it in. This is a picture of Christopher Columbus. It is photoshopped, badly photoshopped, so that Columbus is wearing a Brussels sprout as a hat. Because this week, like so many, has been exhausting, and this amuses me.